Gloria will pick those up. Gloria will pick those up and pass them on to the speakers. Also, it's good for us to have later on. So any questions, any comments you wish to make, please put them in the chat. We will now have a speaker for 20 minutes, more or less, and then we're going to have a 10-minute time for questions, then another speaker for 20 minutes, 10 minutes for questions, and then 20 minutes for discussion, which will be reported back. We're going to divide you. There aren't that many. I'm just wondering, Gloria, if we might just stay as one group rather than to go into breakout rooms.
I think that would be,
well, in which case,
let's have
it give us more time, and people wouldn't have to report back. We can just all stay together and hear what everybody has to say.
I think so. At the moment,
number of nods.
At the moment, yes, but if we get a few more, I guess we'll think about that. If we get,
we'll play it as we move along. Okay, thank you very much. So this is our penultimate webinar. We still have one more next Thursday evening to complete our 7 sessions. Our first speaker today is Sudi Kombo Kona. Sudi is a mother. Sudi is also a teacher, a very, very busy woman who's busy on a move. She's moving job and house. How crazy is that? And she's doing that right now. And so we're more than grateful that she's come to present to everybody today. Sudi was a trustee, but with jobs and everything else, she has just stepped down for a short while. We're hoping she'll return to us. At the moment, she is a religious education teacher. By the way, you also worked for us as an associate for many years, Sudi. I've just remembered that. You didn't put that down. So I'm going to hand you over to Sudi, who will be looking at the racial landscape in modern Britain after Brexit. Have we become a more open society, or is there still some work to do? Sudi.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. When Richard asked me, and then when I was having conversations with Maggie as to what it is that I was going to talk about, that week I'd seen a part of the Jeremy Vine show where Dr. Shola had been talking about after the fallout of Brexit and what does that mean to the British psyche and how we relate to one another. And that was my starting point as to what my talk was going to be about. Gloria, do you mind going to the next slide, please?
Okay, 1 second.
Thank you. So I cast my mind back to 2017 when all of the political leaders were having debates about Brexit. And in one of the debates, I recall Nigel Farage making the claim that Brexit would strengthen relations between Britain and the Commonwealth countries, that previous to Brexit, that the relationship with the EU had been at the expense of the relationship with the Commonwealth. And after the breakaway, that would give people from Commonwealth nations more opportunities to come to Britain, work and live and study. I remember at the time, I wasn't convinced. And I'd felt very much that the line of argument he was using was to try and remove the stain of xenophobia from the Brexit argument. And as unfortunately as time proved, I was correct. Gloria, because I can see myself, is it possible if we can go to the next slide, please?
Sorry, give me a second. I'm just trying to...
Okay, well, not to worry. The next slide literally is various headlines of what our current Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has done this year, with one being that the Court of Appeal stating that the Rwanda plan is illegal, that we have a duty of care, that people who come to these shores are kept safe, and sending them to a country where their safety could not be guaranteed was a failure in our duty. Undeterred, Ms. Braverman is going to take her Rwandan plan to the Supreme Court and to see if she can get the Court of Appeals ruling overturned. Not only that, she has been clearly very busy and has also been wrapped on the knuckles for not providing pregnant and young detainees with fresh fruit and general care. Now, I do think that any well-governed country has the absolute right to monitor and have a very clear idea of how many people they bring into a country, and I wouldn't want anybody to think otherwise. However, as a Christian, as an ethical person, I think that the way that we treat people, who in most instances have fled under difficult circumstances, or even ignoring the wealth of knowledge, of support in our communities that people from other countries have brought, is to totally undermine the value that immigrants have brought into this country. I am a child of immigrants. And what I think is very concerning for all people is the dehumanizing language that is used towards these people, as though they are a problem that needs to be removed and sorted, and that we, as a country where we have rule of law, a country where we still abide by human rights, do not care about the needs and wants of these people. Last week, I saw how in Rhodes, the forest fires, how mainly British tourists fled and they received support from the locals, allowing them to stay in their houses or provided with refreshments. And I just thought, and I just hoped that some of those people who were in that moment had an idea of what it must be like to flee your country. And remember, and I hope that they will remember the amount of compassion that they were given in that moment of need. And I think it is that compassion and the remembrance of that every individual has dignity that needs to be brought into this conversation. And my concern is that all too often it's not. Moving on from Ms. Braverman's exploits, this year, Gloria, can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. This year saw the 75th celebration of Windrush, when a large groups of West Indian economic migrants came to the UK at the behest of the government of the day to help rebuild this nation after the Second World War. Now, it was wonderful to see across the country the amount of different events. At my own school, we were given the opportunity to honor them via history lessons and assemblies, and all of this was wonderful. But it still does not remove the stain of the Windrush scandal that took place. Now, my cat, unfortunately, is sitting on my notes. Off you go. Thank you. Now, as I'm sure, just as a brief reminder, the scandal became public in 2017, and this affected thousands of long-term residents who arrived in 1948 and hadn't, and a larger group had children, but they fell victim to the hostile environment policy. Now, this was a deliberate policy by the Home Office to prevent access, to facilitate the opportunity for people to access healthcare or any other needs they may have, to encourage them to leave the country. Now, an unnamed historian and the sources in The Guardian concluded in their paper, The Historical Roots of the Windrush Scandal, that during the period of 1950 to 1981, every single piece of immigration legislation was designed, at least in part, to reduce the numbers of people with black or brown skin who were permitted to live and work in the UK. And it is the intentionality behind that that I find most distressing. Now, tying that back to Suella Braverman, I think it is, beyond ironic, tragic almost, that Braverman, like myself, who is also the child of immigrants, has chosen not to implement changes that would result in greater scrutiny of the immigration policy. After the scandal, an inquiry was held, and several recommendations were put forward, with three main recommendations being stated as these would be most would like to have. Now, as of this year, she has officially said that she will not run reconciliation events, introduce a migrants commissioner, or review the remit of the role of the independent chief inspector of borders in immigration. So ultimately, what we can take from this, as our unnamed historian said earlier, that there was a concerted effort to reduce the number of people with black or brown skin who were permitted to live and work in the UK, that Ms. Braverman, under, again, another child of immigrants, Rishi Sunak, are very happy for the Home Office to continue business as usual. Okay, now. And Gloria, can you please move on to the next slide? Thank you. Now, I'll only mention the Sewell report because, again, I think in terms of seeing where we are in the 2000s, in terms of race relations, I do think it does provide a very strong talking point. If you do, for anyone sitting and listening, if you do wish to find more information about the Sewell report, I know that my colleagues, I think Father Phil and have already made a very detailed analysis of the Sewell report, which I'm sure you can access on the website. But just to give the top line summary of his report, he concluded that the UK does not have a systemic problem with race. And one of the key indicators that he used were to show that there were East Asian and Indian and Pakistani students and Black African students who were doing very well in the education system. And starkly comparing that would say white working class boys in particular who were doing less well. And this was a sign to show that that the system was more meritocracy was at play here. Now, as Yogi explained, I am a secondary school teacher, and my previous school was based, or still is based, in East London, and we get a snapshot of that all the time. Now, I think it is imperative that we work towards an equitable society where we meet everyone at their point of need, be it those of people of colour, be it those who are working class, be it those who are from the traveller community. So I think it is right and it is proper to alert the fact that we have an issue where a lot of young white working class boys do not feel the education system works for them, understands them, promotes them, encourages them. That should be something that concerns everyone. But back to the original point of Tony Sewell using education as an indicator of racial change in the positive, I don't think it still gives an accurate picture. As you can see from the graph, it shows a split or breakdown of wealth based on racial grouping. And what this is, the graph is from the ONS. However, I have other statistics from the Roundtree Foundation that also, I think, help to put it in context. Now, Dr. Andrea Barry, an economist, disagreed greatly with Tony Sewell. She did not feel that the education, although a good sign, told the full picture. She believed that the wealth gap in the United Kingdom is growing. So for every Pakistani household, that would say have 50p for every £1 of white British wealth. Black Caribbean households would hold 20p for every £1 of white British wealth. Black African and Bangladeshi households have 20p for every £1 of white British wealth. Now, what she found is that irrespective of academic success, the children of these particular groups did not translate into the labor market. So if these children, although they have done very well at school, are not provided with labor opportunities, it meant that BME households found themselves with less savings, less chances of home ownership, and less chances to build wealth. 2 weeks ago on the BBC website, it was talking about, say, food insecurity due to the cost of living crisis. And it said that the main groups who were at the sharpest end of food insecurity, not being able to have necessarily a meal every night, were poorer single parents and Black African families. So although, and I will be remiss, as I know that I have benefited from my parents' efforts within this country, I think we still have to look at the broader picture, that there is still a lot of work left to do. Okay. So can we move on to, I believe, the last slide? Thank you. So if I were to surmise where I think that we're at currently in the country, I think that there has been in the last 20, 30 years, a lot of progress. But I think what the greatest fear is complacency. Although it is wonderful to see people from BME in institutions of power, MPs on the front benches and what have you, there is still a wealth gap, there is still a labour opportunity gap, there is still disparities in medical care, in life outcomes, in education outcomes for marginalised groups. And I think that what we need to be very mindful of is not to be swayed or to be placated by what I call it, political optics. So if we go back just talking about, say, the Windrush, I think it was wonderful, the different types of events, the opportunity for children to learn about it in school. All of this was wonderful. Having Prince Charles come and have a special event to mark and honour the event and the service that people have done. And although we can enjoy and appreciate those things, it cannot allow us to then not push our government to make sure that those who have still not received compensation for what happened to them during the scandal happens. We cannot therefore be complacent by allowing a hostile environment to continue. And if we are allowing ourselves, just because of a wonderful photo op, or that we can say, we now have a prime minister of South Asian heritage running the country, it does not give the complete picture to where we are in this country at the moment. And my last point that I would say that I put to all of you is that, because I'm a great believer that we can only make change when we are all in this together. I think when we look at, say, markers such as race, it helps us to very clearly see where there are inequalities within society. And often marginalized people are the canary in the mine. They're usually the ones who are at the sharpest end. However, those inequalities will eventually come to us all. One example I can give is that I know that a lot of the new rulings about impromptu gatherings and what have you was a direct result of the Black Lives Matter marches. But it was those newfound powers and abilities that then gave the police the green light to behave in the way they did for the Sarah Everard marches. Watching, say, King Charles' coronation, having those who are anti-monarchy being removed from the scene. These are all things that ultimately, even if it starts off by affecting one group, sooner or later, it's something that affects us all. So my opening question, or as Yogi, and when she opened my talk, has Britain become an open society? Yes, the door is open, but it's not fully open. And I think it is still down to all of us, if our hope, our mission is to have an equitable, equal society, to push that door further open. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Sudi. There was so much in that. My gosh, even though I've been listening to you, I think I too will need to go back to the recording and listen to it again. Thank you very, very much for that. I'm going to open it up to questions, but Sudi, if you don't mind, just one question from myself, actually. There's so much in what you've just said, but could you just, for a minute or two, just tell us a little more about what you mean by political optics? You say we should not be placated by political optics.
What I meant by that, so for example, if I use Miss Braverman, because I've probably called her name so many times today, I think it's not lost on me that for a lot of the ways in which she conducts immigration policy, I find distasteful. I'll be very candid. And I know that a lot of people feel that she cannot be held to account because she is a woman of color. And regardless of whether she is a woman of color or not, her policies are still repugnant.
Indeed.
And what I do think is that oftentimes what people will tell us is that if we have one person who is, let's say, CEO of a company, that we should all be happy. And you know, that's wonderful for that particular individual. But if we still have the majority of people from that background still not being able to have positive life outcomes, that is something that should still move us to push for more.
Thank you ever so much, Sri. That's very well explained. Thank you. And now I open you up to questions. Sudi only has 5 minutes with us more. So if you have any questions to Sudi, please. If you put, Richard has a question. Richard, you'll have to unmute for this, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Sudi. I don't want you to say anything that would put you in an embarrassing position. So, but can you say about, can you say anything about whether your experience as a teacher has reinforced the things you've said today?
Wow.
I suppose yes, and as when I make that point that we are all in it together, it is so important because so many of my students, and we were talking about this the other day, just before term ended. Some of my year 8 students were asking me what was the difference between equality and equity.
Mm-hmm.
And I drew on the board, I'm sure you've seen the picture, where equality is where everybody stands on the same plank. And I had one person who was taller than the other and someone who was very short. And I was making the point, is this helpful? And they were like, no. And I said, what do you think would be more helpful? Then one girl drew up and she drew them all staggered. So depending on height was how big the stairs were. And it was something that just really just resonated with me. That is what we should be working to. I think if there's anything, as time has moved on, our identities, what they need, I'm very mindful that I'm very fortunate that my parents were able to say, for example, help me get on the housing ladder. I don't sit here and say, boo-hoo, my life is terrible. I'm very mindful of how I have been helped. But that doesn't mean I can then turn a blind eye to somebody else who does not have that. Yeah, and I think it's that mentality of us all working towards an equitable society. That is what we are working towards. When, say, speaking of race, I think it's a way of showing how society doesn't have proper amounts of equity. But again, you could turn that focus again onto the white working class boys who in my school in Tower Hamlets were the area of focus. The Black African students were excelling. And it's the white working class children, especially the boys, trying to get them engaged in the education process was where they needed the most help. to be able to have an equitable school experience. So yeah.
Thanks, Sudi. Are you happy, Richard? Is there more you want to say?
No, not for now. Thank you.
Anybody else before we lose Sudi? Somebody has put into the chat that this was a most insightful presentation, and I can only ditto and agree with that, Sudi. Amazing as per usual. I'm most grateful to you. Thank you ever so much for your presentation this morning, and thank God we do have it on recording so we can all listen to it again, and more people will be able to get to that. Thanks, Sudi, and good luck with your move.
Yes, God bless you all. Take care. Have a lovely weekend. My pleasure.
Thanks, Sudi. If, like I said, if anybody has any comment to make, please put it into the chat if you don't wish to make it straight out. We'll now move on to our second speaker, and I'm really excited and waiting anxiously to hear. I've known Maggie Byrne for a while now, and every time she speaks, I sit there aghast. Maggie is a member of CARJ. She retired, but is retired now, but previously worked for Amnesty International at their international secretariat for nearly 2 decades. And then she worked in Belfast for a similar length of time with a local human rights group. So you can see Maggie has a fantastic background. This involved her working, among other things, working closely with others on issues of equality and non-discrimination, racial justice, and submissions to various UN bodies, including the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So she's got a fantastic background to speaking to us today on combating racism. And I pass you now on to Maggie.
Sorry, first of all, I'll unmute myself, and then I'll just go through these just 5 slides. Oh, sorry, that's not where it's meant to be, of course. So first of all, you can all hear me. Sorry that I have to follow on from Sudi, such an excellent presentation, and then this fantastic build up by Yogi. But I'll come back to it in a minute. I wanted to really emphasize that the talk for this session is Combating Racism, an Agenda for the Future of Britain. And as you can imagine, when Richard suggested that I talk to this item, I said, oh, for heaven's sake, it's enormous. You know, what on earth could you say? And what can I say in particular? But I think I'm going to focus very much on looking forward. We've had several seminars now, excellent seminars on the experience of racism in society, and what we should, you know, our experience over the last 40 years of CARJ. But I want to look ahead and say, look at the future. Let's discern the future, and what possible contribution could CARJ make to greater racial justice over the next 40 years. I think I have to start with sort of an apology, because I really have no expertise in the question of racial justice in Britain. Because as Yogi said, I was either engaged in international human rights work with Amnesty or locally, but in the Northern Ireland context only. So that work in Northern Ireland particularly involved me in issues of racial justice, but often, you know, not indirectly sort of thing. But one experience from Northern Ireland that I wanted to that I thought might be helpful to discuss with CARJ is that back in '95, when there was one of the sort of earlier ceasefires, it broke down, and then we had to build up to the peace process in '98. But in '95, we had organised a very big conference, and we developed what we called a human rights agenda for change. And it was a kind of a list of things that we thought were necessary if we were going to have a more just society, and therefore a more just society, a more peaceful society. And I think that this might be an interesting model for CARJ to think, to mark its 40th anniversary, to draw on the seminars you've done so far and all your previous work, and actually develop a racial justice agenda for change, because that actually helps which people. So why do we need such a, this is of course my perspective, and I think why we need such an agenda. I'm just wondering if I can, yeah, it's fine. I can move the photos out of the way so I can see my own text. So basically, I think one of the big problems now is this current use of culture wars to either say racial justice is a sort of woke issue, and that's obviously meant to be, you know, very, very rude claim, or that we're in a post-racial society. And Sudi referred to the Sewell report, and that's obviously a lot of concerns that it was saying it's all okay now, everything's hunky-dory. We're also meant to be, even in the recent riots in France around the killing of that young boy, oh well, it's much better here than in France because we keep data and so on. And it's also claimed that it's harmful to the cause of true integration to focus on the distance we still have to go. You know, we should be just, as said, like Sudi said, being a bit more complacent. We've come a long distance, you know, let's not push it too hard. And I think even in progressive moves, I've certainly seen it in some of the comments we've had previously about Racial Justice Sunday. Sometimes people seem more comfortable discussing diversity and multiculturalism rather than racism and racial justice, but I don't think that goes far enough. So that's why I think we need such an agenda around which to mobilize people. And then why should CARD do it? Well, I think as its name denotes, it understands implicitly it's a question of racial justice and not just a matter of being nice to each other. As a faith organization, it has credibility. You know, I just think that when CARD talks about there's a sort of continuing problem, even if it's a changing nature of racial injustice, I think that will carry weight. And as a faith organisation with a very diverse constituency, it can explain the complexity and variety of that experience of racial injustice across different racial groups. And it's never a matter of one size fits all. And obviously, as a Catholic organisation, it needs to help the church, the clergy, religious lay, and its many organisational arms, all the various Catholic organisations that exist, to understand the nature of racial injustice and to learn to tackle it. So that's why I think CARD needs to be doing this. And so what would it sort of include? I think the agenda would start off with expressing solidarity with those experiencing racial injustice and talk about how that solidarity can best be shown in church and wider society. So I think sometimes there isn't, well, as the Sewell report sort of suggests, it's somehow, there's sometimes a belittling of the current experiences of racial injustice, and we need to recognize that straight out. You know, if anything, I think Sudi was being quite gentle in her criticism. I do think there's a lot to do. And then I think it would go into a reasonable amount of detail about the positive measures that are required under a whole range of issues: policing, education, health, criminal justice, housing, work. Now, a lot of that data material has already come up in the course of this seminar series, and as I said, it's available in previous CARD material. But there's also a lot out there, the Runnymede Trust particularly, and I think it'd be really usefully brought together in one place. I just wanted to, you know, give some examples of that. For example, under education, you know, certainly Catholic schools, what are Catholic schools or all general schools doing to monitor the racial diversity of the teaching staff, of its leadership, of its foundation governance? What are they doing to monitor the content of its teaching, its student relationship with students, school exclusion data, etc.? Obviously, with policing, you know, what work could be done with the Catholic Association of Police Officers to see what they're doing about racial justice awareness training, addressing complaints about racist behaviour, gathering data, particularly things like when we've got the Casey review, we've got a lot of material there, but those reviews sort of remain on the shelves unless there are groups constantly asking questions about them. What are you doing about this? Criminal justice, just this week on criminal justice, I read Black defendants spend 70% longer than white people on remand. So whereas they're 18% of the population, so Black defendants spend 70% longer than white people on remand, and yet of those on remand, 14% of black defendants are acquitted and 8% of white defendants are acquitted. So already it seems that black defendants are remanded more extensively than white defendants. And then when they are remanded, they spend 70% longer on remand than, and this is just one statistic. Last night, if any of you were watching TV, there was this terrible case of this woman, a pregnant woman who lost her child in prison because of lack of services. She was black. They didn't make much of that issue because already it was bad enough that she was pregnant and that she hadn't got the set. But I wonder if that's also relevant, because certainly in health we are hearing about statistics about you know, issues around maternal mortality and so on. So CARD could be liaising with Catholic nursing and other associations to see what's happening in terms of data gathering, and how do we support staff tackle racist attitudes in healthcare, and it goes on in social care, work, housing. I won't even bother to go too much into the church issues, because I think the next seminar, Father Phil is going to be talking about that in detail. I don't think he's here today, but he did say at one of the previous seminars, don't go into that, I want to save all that for his seminar. So I will be listening. I can't attend myself, but I will be listening to the recording with great interest, and if sending him some more thoughts if he doesn't come up with a very good agenda for change in the church. I think there's lots to be said about that. So back to so I was saying, so I think there's lots of things that need to be done in these respective areas. I think it'd be really helpful that they're brought together in a kind of fairly, reasonably comprehensive way. It doesn't have to be, but just some of that material brought together in one place. And then around that agenda, CARD would provide a strong moral voice about the sinfulness, to pick up on exactly the word that Yogi used at the beginning, the sinfulness of racial injustice, and for a faith response wherever it occurs. If it is as useful as it was in Northern Ireland, you can use such an agenda as a platform to speak out publicly and routinely. You just keep it as a sort of standard document that you kind of, because unfortunately the facts won't change too quickly. So then that means that you could involve, when there's a sort of, you want a press release about your 40th anniversary, you can quote some of the statistics from the Agenda for Change, or you obviously include it on your website. Opportunistically use media occasions like this Windrush, the Stephen Lawrence, the anniversaries, to point a way forward. So suddenly there's an interest in media on X, then CARD has got this ready-made, yes, and here are some of the problems, and this is what you should be doing about it. And you should be doing about it. Again, there are official bodies exploring racial justice. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, there was previously, I don't need to tell you, I'm sure, a Commission on Racial Equality, but that then got kind of subsumed into the broader Equality and Human Rights Commission. So you need to make sure that it is maintaining a high level of interest on racial justice questions. And when they're making submissions to Parliament or international bodies like the UN Convention Against Racial Discrimination, or when there's a specific inquiry, the COVID-19 inquiry, I'm involved in a little group that works on social care. So we put in a submission to COVID-19 about attitudes in care homes and so on. But we also made reference to the gender and racial impact of COVID-19. So, CARD could be making a submission, just a short submission saying, these are our concerns. So when things are happening anyway, you've already got your ready-made, you know what you want to say, and you get it in there. And then hopefully bit by bit, people will start to take it up. And then the final thing, which again, I imagine Father Phil will go into in more detail, advise the Catholic hierarchy, and via them, parishioners in the pews, what they can practically do to tackle racial injustice. One thing I forgot to mention in terms of, being opportunistic, we're obviously coming up for an election next, national elections next year. Not quite sure when, but, you want to be ready at that time to be going to candidates and asking them questions about what they're going to be doing about racial justice, and the parishioners in the pews could be asked to ask questions about what they're doing about racial injustice or justice, but even more importantly. So I don't know that. I think that's sort of essentially what I wanted to say. I maybe I should just finish with someone cited to me recently a recent quote from Pope Francis, where he said he likened racism to a virus that quickly mutates and instead of disappearing, goes into hiding and lurks in waiting. So racism is a virus that quickly mutates and instead of disappearing, goes into hiding and lurks in waiting. And I think that, you know, one of the good things that came out of the Equality Act and previous campaigning around equality and racial justice was that we are now gathering much more data on how policies affect different constituencies. And we need to be able to use that material and show that even with good intentions, it's not delivering in many, many ways, and use that to then point a way forward so that people have a sense of you know, positive direction. So that's, I think, all I can say at the moment. Thank you for listening. Hope that was helpful.
Maggie, that was most helpful. Thank you very, very much. And thank you for setting our agenda. I'm just thinking, I can see the trustees from CARD saying, oh my goodness, we've got 12, 15 years work here to do. Thank you, Maggie. That's really, really very interesting indeed. Again, I think we're going to have to take that recording and document what you've just said and look into all the advice you've just given. So many, many thanks, Maggie. I'm now going to open up to everyone. If there are any questions to Maggie or any comments you wish to make, and now is the time to do so. I think before everybody starts, Richard, Maggie mentioned statistics of young people being expelled or suspended from schools. And you have a little story to tell about one of our workers in a Catholic school, one of our associates going into a Catholic school. I wonder if you would just repeat that, please, and then I'll open up to everybody else. Do you remember the one, Richard?
No, I don't.
Okay, please correct me because I remember, but I probably don't remember it as well. We had a lady go into a Catholic school. This new head of a very, very well-known secondary Catholic school in London looked at his statistics. There's something called a black book in schools, and into the black book, they document children who are suspended or expelled. And he found that his statistics were really very, very high on Black young people, not just Black boys, but Black young people. There were many more of them expelled or suspended. And he thought, you know, that there was something racist about it. And he even questioned himself as to whether he was racist, that he had not picked up on this before. So he asked Kaj if we would send somebody in to work with the young people, to do a series of sessions with the young people. And we sent one of our associates in, and she did a few sessions with the young people, and he called her back to do a few sessions with the parents. And he then, the head, wrote to us and asked if we would double up on the number of sessions over a period of 3 years, because he found it so helpful and so encouraging, and that it had made such a big difference with his staff and with his parents. Have I summed that up more or less, Richard? Do you now remember?
Yes, yes, thank you, yes.
Yeah. So, you know, it can be done. And it's about the head recognizing that there was something not right, because he looked at his statistics and he found it to be unjust. And then questioned himself as to whether he was racist. And when our associate went in, he attended those sessions and he learned from the sessions and thought, you know, this is what I need to do again and again with all of my staff, and even brought in parents to these sessions. So it can be done.
And he sent us £1,000.
That's right. Yes, he was so grateful. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Thanks, Richard. I just wanted to pick up on that because Maggie's absolutely right. These are the things that not just that one school, but all our schools, all our Catholic establishments really ought to be looking at. the bishops, after the Stephen Lawrence case, had put out a fantastic booklet. I don't know if Richard, again, I forget the title of it, but it was a booklet which asked all Catholic establishments to assess their own workplace in a number of areas on racial justice. And I know for a fact that most people don't even know that the book exists, never mind using it in their workplaces. Right, Richard?
Could I just say to Maggie, and well, to everybody, I think your notion of an agenda for change is brilliant with our 40th anniversary coming up. Whether we have that agenda ready for the end of the year or whether it's a project during
5 years, yeah.
I'm not sure. So I really value that. I wanted to just make one comment about part of your agenda for change where you say advise the hierarchy and through them the parishioners, and I might say advise the parishioners and through them the hierarchy.
Yeah. I'm not so sure that the hierarchy will be listening to anything. I can see more hands, and I think Brendan Schmack.
Yeah, I just want to affirm that point that Richard has made. You know, I really feel our focus needs to be changing the attitudes in the pews. You know, I don't really. The problem has been, well, in my view, there's very little coming from the hierarchy to the pews on racial justice. You know, and we really feel our energy should be in actually changing attitudes. Here in Liverpool, with the group in Liverpool, we've just launching a program of visiting parishes, appealing for membership for cards.
Excellent.
We've got our first booking in September, but we've got some other places lined up because we've decided that it's attitudinal change of the people in the pews. That's the issue for the church, not working through the hierarchy. The hierarchy will follow us. You know, I mean, if we look at the history of the Catholic Church, we look at the Vatican II, whatever, the changes came from the people, and a lot of the changes of Vatican II were already happening out in the world, particularly in parts of Europe and South America, and then they get affirmed. That's the way the Catholic Church changed. It does change from the bottom up, even though it's I believe, even though it's a very hierarchical situation. So the appeal I'm making is changing attitudes, working with the laity is the way to start, not through the top down.
Thank you, Brendan, and great to hear of what you're doing in Liverpool. Thank you. Anybody else?
I think Nana, did Nana have a hand up earlier on? Nana, sorry.
Nana?
I didn't have my hand up, but no worries, Maggie. But very similar to Richard and Brendan, I was just thinking about the role that the church should be making, and I know it's doing what it can. I went to the Southwark seminar on race a few weeks back, and I know there's another seminar coming up. And yeah, very much in agreement that the leadership is bottom up. But I was just going to ask anyway, Maggie, from your presentation, where do you place the leadership at the moment on this issue? In the sense of, for me, it's Racial Justice Sunday, everyone comes to mass, we all wear our cultural outfits, and then it's done. And I'm not seeing in the media enough of the church voice speaking out about all those issues that Sudi shared with us earlier around immigration, around the way that refugees are almost scarily being spoken of as cockroaches, you know, something to be put in the middle of a water on on a floating hotel and not being part of community. And so I'm just wondering, to be sustainable in our work, how much do we need the leadership of the Catholic Church to be backing all the work that Brendan and others are doing in dioceses around England and Wales? How much do we need the leadership of the church as well?
Sorry, Yogi, if I sort of give you some
Yes,
reactions.
please.
I mean, I suppose this would be something to really pursue at the next seminar, because we could just do one. I mean, you are going to do one on the church alone, so I think it's a really, really important thing to come back to if it doesn't raised automatically. I'm sort of between the two. I mean, I definitely agree with Richard and Brendan about we need attitudinal change, and that can come, can come most effectively from the bottom up. But I work my sort of main hat here in Britain since I moved back from Northern Ireland has been working the Justice and Peace Network, and I coordinate the West London Justice and Peace Network. And it doesn't matter however much good work is being done. We meet 3 times a year, and however much good work is being done around that table, each one of them, it'll almost always depend on the attitude of the parish priest to that issue. So if they've got an excellent parish priest, we hear this long, they're doing the work, but they've had the okay, and the parishioners know that it's okay, and they're hearing constantly that this is part of their faith journey and responsibility. And the people who come saying, oh, I can't get anything done, it's because the parish priest is either not interested, or in some cases even is almost antithetical to the agenda. So we are a pretty hierarchical church, and so it does seem that we need the leadership to be on board as well. So I'm afraid Carge has got this double problem, that it's got to talk in both directions at the same time, obviously saying the same things, but and I definitely agree with you now about and that's come up time and time again at these seminars about we're not hearing the bishops out there on these issues. And even to some extent, because the examples that you give about immigration and refugees, even to some extent that is sometimes we are hearing more now from the bishops about that. It was a really excellent presentation recently, but not about racial justice, not about the communities that live here, have lived here for generations. And I didn't mention, I should have mentioned, because there was reference to it in studies, and I'm a child of immigrants, but my parents happen to be white and Irish, so one generation in, and I can pass however I want to be. I can either promote my Irishness, or I can say, oh, I was born here, and no one queries that, or no one even gets to the point of saying, where are you from, or where are you from originally, or what's your heritage. And so as a society, we've got a long way to go, it seems to me. But I think a key thing I'd say with the church and our faith is that somehow racial justice is not seen as part of the issue. I would be really, one time I went a really good talk about the environment, and then excellent parish priest was talking about, because he was at the event, was talking about, he said, I don't think in all my time as a priest I've ever heard someone come to confession and talk about that they've been damaging the environment. This was, I thought, the first thing, well, actually that would never have occurred to me, to say that, I haven't been doing proper recycling, I don't think about my purchasing power, all the rest of it. And I bet that's absolutely the same thing for racial justice. For people who either are themselves racist, or engage in racist behavior, or collude in it, or are suffering from it, are they bringing any of that to their faith leaders and to the people around them? That's why the White City experience, I think, was really, really one to actively encourage, and so on. So, because again, in fact, funny enough, that was the same. Father Richard is the priest that mentioned this in the environment. He hadn't ever heard anyone come to confession. So what a surprise. He's the one that suddenly hits the thing that, we need to tackle racial justice in our churches. So sorry, that's taking up too much time, but I agree with all of you is basically what I'm saying, but you've got a big job ahead of you.
I'm so grateful to you, Maggie. Thank you very much for that. I often I have a very serious problem, and I don't want to come across as being anti-immigrant, because that's most certainly not true. I'm not anti-immigrant, nor am I anti-refugee. But I do think when we ask the question, who is my neighbor? It is not the neighbor you're bringing in from another country. It is your neighbor next door, and I think we miss the point on racial justice. We don't see the people in our parishes. Where again, I don't want it to be seen to be critical of work being done for refugees or for migrants, but I feel it is easier speaking of these people coming in rather than tackling the problems that we have and experience with the people who belong. They don't feel they belong, but they should belong. So the Black people sitting in our pews, who were born and brought up in this country, are not getting the treatment they should be getting. And I just sometimes wonder if people see that difference. Do they see there is a difference? Because even when we speak of immigrants, this country treats white immigrants quite differently to the way they treat immigrants of color. You can just look at when, and again, I want to make absolutely certain I have nothing against helping Ukrainians. I think they deserve our help. But there has been so much help for Ukrainians. But do we hear of the same kind of help for people who come from the African countries, from the Middle Eastern countries? I've not heard it. I've definitely not heard it from the church. I've not heard it from neighbors or from parishioners, and I don't know how. I don't have that kind of academic background. I don't have the not even the language to be able to express my absolute distress at the ignorance of our people who are here within the church, who are ignored.
Just to pick up on one of the things that Sudi said about we're all in this together, I think that would be a very important, slogan for part of this agenda, because exactly what you say, Yogi, that the risk is that people will start vying for, well, our issue is, more urgent or more important than this issue, or we're being excluded or something like that. That her passing reference to young working class but white boys. There shouldn't be a sort of zero-sum game where focusing in on racial injustice in education around people of African or Caribbean descent or Asian descent somehow means that you don't care about the education of young working class white boys. Or it has to be done at the expense of them. So I think it's really important that's why, again, the agenda for change, because you can also explore some of these ideas together, that it's really important that we're open as a society to immigration and refugees, and that this needs to be done on a non-racial basis, and there are misunderstandings, anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry. Again,
no, I agree with you. She also said that there should be an equitable society where we meet every single person at their point of need. Might I just say that many years ago now, and it could almost be 15 years ago or more, where Kaj did work with working class white boys. We as an association looked into the whole concept of them failing and how we could improve on them, on their educational needs. So that has already happened, and we continue to do that. So it's not something that we don't see or don't want to see. The idea for us isn't this a pun? It's not a black and white issue. For us, it is about justice for all. And when we speak of the equitable status, it's that child drawing the staircase. We want everyone to see where you are on that rung of stairs, and to be able to give them an equal platform. So it is something we have been working towards, but we need the help and support of every other Catholic in the country, in every parish. And so I'm behind Brendan, it would be an amazing bit of work to be able to work with parishioners. But Maggie, as you say, you can work with those parishioners unless they get the go-ahead from the parish priest. It doesn't happen. We still have monochrome parishes when it comes to the fabric of our churches. Why is that? You know, we speak of racial justice year in, year out, day in, day out, and we still have that. Gloria, you have your hand up?
Sorry,
Gloria.
I was on mute. I have a question to Maggie.
Please.
It's my strong impression, but I might be wrong, that when solutions are offered for racism or racial justice, but they come from a conservative side, these are seen as invalid and illegitimate, as opposed to when when solutions are suggested from, say, the left side of the aisle. I believe that the politicization of race and what we must do in our society is very damaging to the cause. I don't know if I might be of a wrong impression. I was wondering if you can comment, because, for instance, I do know that the commission, the Sewell report was commissioned by like a conservative government. So I think the reason why it was the good bits of it were not seen as something that should be promoted, or it was really jumped on as soon as it was offered, was because it was offered from the right side of the aisle. And I just feel that
we miss out on the
we're
good.
politicizing the issue of race and racism and saying, oh, you know, the solutions can only come from one part of the aisle or one section.
Well, I would agree that that's a worry, and I think that's all the more reason why a group like CARD, which is coming at this from a faith perspective, not a party political or a partisan perspective, is you know, not necessarily the sole group, but one of the obvious groups that could really run with this, because I don't think that CARD would be politicizing. I think it is politicized, you know, and not even just sort of simply left and right. Look at the, you know, arguments within the Labour Party about anti-Semitism, and does that constitute racism or does it not, and so on. So it's a very political issue, but that makes all the more reason why a group that doesn't have a, you know, a party political or a partisan agenda, but has a faith agenda. This is what we mean by racial justice. And therefore, and we'll critique whatever comes out from that perspective. So, for example, my comments on Sewell, I didn't follow Sewell in the earlier stages. I can't even remember when it was set up, but I know that some of the people who had been closer to it were quite dubious from the beginning. One, as to why it had been set up, and two, as to the composition of the people on the commission. So I don't know about, as I said, I don't know the roots to it. Don't know, but I know that there was some suspicion about its objectives. I'm just judging it on, and my kind of somewhat rude remarks about it are made on the basis of what they concluded, and I'm just reading it in the round, and it doesn't reflect, again, you know, obviously it's in anything, and again, if you do this human rights, you know, racial justice agenda for change, you obviously want to recognize some of the advances, and many of the advances that have been made through anti-discrimination legislation and so on. And the very fact that we know what's going wrong. To come back to France, one of the things that I didn't realize before is that they were talking about racist policing, but apparently they don't keep a record of, for example, the fact that we can turn to Stop and Search and say, you know, you're twice as likely, or whatever the number is, if you're black, to be stopped, and certainly male and young, to be stopped and searched. But in France, they don't do that because, of course, they're you know, we're all French, and, you know, it doesn't matter what color skin you've got, so we don't record this. Well, if you don't record it, you won't know if there's a problem. Well, you probably do if you're black or from a minority community, but, you know, the whole society. Whereas, at least in Britain now, with our recording, we have access to this sort of information, and we can see problems, and we can then go back. I thought the interesting thing about the remand was when it said, you know, 70% more people detained longer if they're black. but it was really useful that they then put what percentage was of people who are black who were released immediately, because that also because otherwise, you'd say, well, maybe maybe there are more black people that commit more serious crimes. Well, here you are, but actually it's a higher percentage of them that are released without detention. So anyway, sorry, this is a very long-winded way to say, Gloria, I think you're absolutely right to worry about the politics of it. It is a very highly political and politicized sphere, but that's all justice is, and all equality and anti-discrimination campaigns are. And I just think Carge is in an ideal situation to try to kind of maneuver through that and say, sets a plague on all your houses. This is what we think is happening, and this is what we think needs to be done.
Thanks, Maggie. Do I have anybody else? Anyone want to make a comment on that? We've got Melvin with us, and Melvin's not said anything yet.
Oh. No, still mute.
There we go. Sorry, hit the wrong buttons, or they didn't respond well. Thank you, Yogi, and it's good to see everybody after such a long time.
Good to see you.
See these events still going on and these discussions, which are highly valuable in themselves, but also very important in terms of the different phases of transition that these issues go through. And Maggie mentioned that term, sort of mutation. It's not just mutation of racism, which is actually happening. I think Sudi actually illustrated this really well around how different groups within the political zeitgeist are viewed on being manipulated within the sort of political economic discourse. It's very easy to get kind of caught up in that, in the sense of, where we stand and what progress has been made. The fact that we have three prominent politicians, or three cabinet ministers, cabinet members who are from quite obvious minority or immigrant backgrounds. And that in itself is a manipulation in some degrees, probably more crudely so than having Obama as the first president of the Black president of the United States. But this is the sort of thing that's going on. So we have this kind of mutation as a form of manipulation and exploitation going on because of the power games that are at stake. So we've got to bear that in mind, that we're not just simply talking about social dynamics here, or even conflict, which is the area that I'm constantly embroiled in terms of research and analysis. There's raw power going on here, and you could say, oh, it's soft power because it's civilized and it's institutional and so on. But then we overlook the systemic issues that we have, or we underplay the systemic issues. I just think some very interesting points have been made here that I just wanted to kind of touch on. And this Carge, for me, has always been this balance about how do you influence the church as a institution, and at the same time reach out to the laity in a way that actually is going to register with people and kind of elicit an appropriate response. Obviously, the structural issues in the church and the power issues are constantly going to be a problem. Yogi, you'll recall that mini series of workshops we did at seminary colleges, or two seminary colleges, where we got a mixed reaction from the seminarians around these very, very tricky issues. And what we were basically doing was presenting them with a very pithy and daunting prospect of going into parishes and taking up the racial justice agenda. And, I was taken aback by some of those responses because it was pretty tense and uncomfortable at times. And so we still got to concentrate on the voice in the church, and the power in the church, whether we look at the power in terms of, a macro to micro scale. If an individual priest is feeling uncomfortable for whatever reason, around these issues and these concerns within their parish or within society, that's going to reflect quite heavily in terms of how any individuals or groups of lay people can actually then address these as part of the church. Okay, they can join progressive groups if they want, activist groups and organizations and what, but that won't change things within the church. So that's a pretty tricky and very difficult situation to address in some ways. But I like the focus on, hey, this is about sinfulness. Okay.
Sorry.
And it's a moral issue. It's about social responsibility. It's not about actually sort of sitting on the fence and so on and so forth. How can we, as society, to reconcile these issues, whether it's the difficulty of newcomers coming into society and the tensions that that breeds up right across society, not just in, traditional white working class communities and now feel disenfranchised and politically betrayed and so on. It comes in different degrees. Brexit roused a response within, Black and Asian communities around those families and communities that have been here for decades, if not generations, because they felt, hey, we're being shortchanged by these Central and Eastern Europeans who come in swaggering and making all these demands and have these expectations and claims to eligibility and so on and so forth that we have only just kind of got a grasp of and secured for ourselves. So there are all sorts of tensions and difficulties here. I think it's wrong to have a victim. Maggie, you'll actually recognize this term from Northern Ireland, a hierarchy of victims within the racial justice sphere. Okay, we're all victims in this, whether we are directly victims or whether we're actually witnessing it and therefore being impacted by it. So the journey of reconciliation on this requires truth. So the institution should uphold truth on these matters, no matter whether it's a specific issue or event, or whether it's the continuum, or whether we appeal to the laity and give them strength and support on what are very, very difficult issues for individuals and families and communities to take on board. It's a journey. It's a journey for us just as much as it is for anybody else. But some very valuable points have been raised here. I will try and come to Father Phil's session because I think we need to have some focus in that around power issues in the church. Even, lay members of the church hold power on this through their attitudes and opinions or their apathy or their lack of appetite to take this on board. Okay, so how do we deal with that? How do we reconcile that as an organization, as a network, as a group of concerned individuals? And then the structural power is built in. Okay, it's bolted in, it's solid, it's there. We can kind of bang our heads against it. So power, inequality, equity, equanimity, these things are valuable in terms of actually talking about the church and what it could or what it should be doing. So we've got this very tricky balancing act still around the micro and the macro scales. The church and laity campaign focus. I think that's always been a challenge for Carge, and Carge has been courageous and very tenacious in sticking with that. But the issues will always be there, but how we can actually address them and be that voice of influence, that voice of power, still remains. Sorry, that was all a bit long-winded. It didn't intend to be a stream of consciousness, but some really valuable and important points have been raised that kind of got me roused.
Thank you for highlighting them, Melvin. I really appreciate that, and I'm sure everybody else does too. Thank you. One of the reasons for us moving into smaller groups is that we give it's an opportunity for everyone to express some thought. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I know Celia and Alison and Aditone, you haven't said anything, but please feel free if there is something you would like to say. We'd like to hear. And I know, Celia, you always have something really, really valuable to give. So does Alison and Aditone. So please, do feel free if you want to say something.
Yogi.
Something valuable to
but I would really like to ask Maggie a little bit more about the Northern Ireland model. She uses that as a way of, you know, putting an agenda for Kaj. Could you talk a little bit more about the Northern Ireland model and whether it was actually, who led on it, and whether it was actually useful in, and how Kaj could learn from the way it was perhaps put into place? It just a little bit more on it, Maggie, if you could.
Yeah, actually, someone is just writing up an article, and it'll be finished this week. He'll submit it this week, so I might send it round, and Gloria wouldn't mind emailing it around to people, because it actually talks through how human rights and equality kind of built in step by step into the what eventually became the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, peace agreement. But just specifically on the agenda for change, we had, as I said, I worked with a small human rights organisation. It would be the equivalent of Liberty here, but given that it was in Northern Ireland, everything was even more kind of tense and difficult, and obviously a very divided society. So exactly the point that was being made earlier about needing to find a route through it, a language through it that you could actually talk to both communities and that they could sort of cohere around was tricky. But we'd started to have meeting of a few of the sort of the groups working on this, so Liberty and the Scottish Council for Civil Liberties and the Irish Council, and came together and issued on the Human Rights Day, 10th of December, a sort of common declaration. And then thought, well, we actually need to start bringing this out into the wider, you know, not the human rights folks or the people that always talk about the same things, but then convened meeting. I think there were about 300 people at it. As I said, it was one of the first, it was the earlier ceasefire, not the one that actually held in the end, but the earlier ceasefire. And so there was a sort of kind of eagerness to talk about, well, in the new environment, you know, what we learned from the conflict, what we learned from the horrors of the past, and what do we need to do going forward. And so we had a conference, we had several speakers at it, someone from South Africa, someone from Central America, we had a US politician, but really it was the working parties that came up because they'd been sort of working on different aspects, just like I was saying, you know, so some of it was looking at what we call constitutional protections, like we'd long been arguing for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. This was before the Human Rights Act had come into play, but we wanted something specific to Northern Ireland. We also argued for institutional changes, so we needed reform of policing, criminal justice system. We needed to look at issues around equality and non-discrimination, and arguments about dealing with the legacy of the past. So I think we came up with like 18 recommendations from this very large group and mixed politically. And then we kind of almost like grouped them into 5 like areas to make it easy to explain to the wider public, and then just kept pushing those at any opportunity that arose. So for example, when our small group had access you know, to the early versions of the Good Friday Agreement, we got on the phone to some of the politicians and said, well, you know, here are some of the things that you need to be including in that text. And it was very fun. I probably shouldn't waste time on it, but it was very funny because we couldn't admit that we'd seen the text because it was so confidential. So we had to say, well, if such and such was being said, of course you'd want to. And we tried to do that across, to deal with Gloria's point, across the political spectrum, and obviously different politicians interested in different aspects of the agreement. But so I suppose what happened, and why I think it's a sort of interesting model, and it's just the process, in that it was kind of done, if you like, initially from the inverted commas experts, so like yourselves and, you know, Runnymede Trust, all that sort of material, drawing that together, but then engaging with wider circles. In this case, it'd be very much the hierarchy, the people in the pews, the people working in justice and peace already, and saying how do we move these aspects of the agenda forward, and then just using the opportunities as they arise. You know, so some issue arises about policing, and then you've already got some of the statements that you want to make, and they probably will last for quite some time because, as I said, these problems aren't going to be resolved very, very quickly. But it provided us with a credible list of things to be doing, to focus in on, and gave us material that, as I said, we could just use opportunistically when occasions arose. And since those ceasefires kind of collapsed initially, the agenda wasn't used for quite a while. It really only came into play then when we were able to negotiate, when the agreement was negotiated and we were able to influence people. So I think it's really just because you've got a 40th anniversary coming up. That's quite an interesting little, people mark anniversaries by doing certain things. And so it would be open to Kaj to say, right, this is one of the things that we're going to offer to the general debate, either in the church alone or in society more widely, about what needs to happen around racial justice. You could even get, if you wanted to keep it more narrowly to just what the church should be doing, my instinct is that would be a lost opportunity, but it's up to Kaj as you carry on. Did that kind of respond a bit to what you were asking, Celia?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Maggie. Yeah.
Thanks, Maggie. We've got Deacon Joseph and then Gloria. Deacon Joseph.
Hello, good morning. I'm pleased to be with you for a long time. We have not met for quite a long time, and I've been listening to the contribution made by the last four speakers, especially Maggie, Yogi, and Mervyn, regarding the issues in the community, especially in the church. As you know, Kaj has been working so hard over the years after the first National Congress held, and the bishops have also been on board to support the work of Kaj. And I think we concentrate mostly now on the major issues like asylum seekers and immigration and so on. But we tend to forget the actual issues that confront those immigrants who are still living in the country, especially in our parishes and everywhere. And Maggie was correct to mention about too much power vested in some of the areas. And I quite remember just now, Marvin also spoke about too much power vested on some leaders, especially if you take our parish priests and some lay people in the parishes. These are the issues we need to find out. In what ways can we bring them on board so that they may also understand the actual issues of the immigrant, the Black people living in the country? Because there are some issues that are not, we have ignored, not that we ignored, but because of the major issues. And we need to find ways and means, as Marvin said, to address those issues. So too much power, as in the first Congress you mentioned, is rested on the parish priest. And there's a way we need to find out how we could deal with that. For example, in terms of the obtaining sacraments, it's a major issue, like marriages preparations. A lot of people finding difficulties in even getting their things sorted out in their own parishes. Even though we have ethnic chaplaincies and so on, but some of the people prefer to be in their parishes. They need to be supported. And there are other communities who are without major chaplaincy supported the bishops. And they also, their activities should also be, or their voice should also be heard, because they now appear to be voiceless. No one speaking for them. In terms of baptism, school applications, we spoke many years ago. They are still existing, but we are not addressing the issues because we are not getting the actual people involved to get involved. So we need to look on these issues, especially if you talk about church booking, getting a church for funerals and so on for our people. As I go right, very, very difficult. So I think we should do something to help. We also mentioned about the equitable, we talk about we will never have a perfect world. We know there must be some racism, but it's getting too much underground. And this must be surfaced so that we can help our people. Especially we mentioned about racial justice.
Sorry, I'm just going to cut in there, Joseph, because it is now 11:30. And I know that Gloria also has a question to Maggie, and then I want Richard to round up. So
No, it's fine.
can I just say, can you finish very quickly, Joseph?
Yeah, so you mentioned about the racial justice Sundays. Well, it's an example of what the reason, because racial justice is not patronized in the parishes. It's the only way we can talk about racism, but it's not. So we need to find ways and means to go back to do all this things so that we can have our voice heard. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Gloria, very, very quickly.
No, that's fine. I was trying to raise my hands for Deacon Joseph because he couldn't.
Okay.
Yeah, he couldn't raise his.
Yeah. Thanks, Gloria. It just leaves me now to say a very, very big thank you to both Sudi and to Maggie. Those were such superb talks, Maggie. You could see we could continue with this discussion forever and a day because they were so interesting. Thank you again and again for giving up your time and for producing such fantastic reports to us. I also want to say thank you to everybody else who has come this morning, because Saturday mornings are sacrosanct for some people, and yet they've given up the time to come to listen to us. Do please go and tell others that it is being recorded and that they can listen to the recordings if they've missed out. I mean, I think it's too valuable not to listen to. And I'm just going to ask Richard quickly to give you a very quick advert on our talks next Thursday evening, because again, we'd like you to attend and we'd like you to encourage others to attend too.
Thanks, Yogi. Oh, thanks, Yogi. Next Thursday, the webinar will build on this. This was what should be doing in the future in society, and Father Phil and Richard Reddy, the ecumenical worker for Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, will be the speakers, and they will be talking specifically about what the church should be doing in the future. I think we need to look at these two together as we move forward, especially into Carja's 40th anniversary. And we will want to include in an agenda for change what the church should be doing, but I don't want to lose the important question of what society should be doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks again, everybody. I'm going to close. My apologies that we're closing 3 minutes late, but I'm sure you'll all agree that it is really difficult after listening to Maggie and getting answers back from Maggie to close. Thanks again, Maggie, and thank you everybody for coming. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. God bless. Bye.